In the beginning, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat.
No, Odysseus, let him rack his brains with you and the other captives.
I
How to fight
guilty.
Impossible. Trust me.
No one to weep for me, my friends. No wedding song.
Amo verumque cano, Troiae qui primus laboris Italiam
Dante ha fatto il pieno e per gli altri è rimasto ben poco, which means that Dante filled up.
I was the more deceived.
Confess that you were very bad to hurt my feelings.
Cried Candide, I'm through.
Enough. Who are you then?
Part of that force which would do evil evermore, and yet
She was eating a maraschino ice at that precise moment.
There is no
When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous dung beetle.
Hi, here we go again. Now, finally, we can talk about Dante. You guys were chafing at the bit last time to talk about Dante. We've made quite a historical leap from the last hour. We have leapt some 1,300 years. And we have leapt into a very different worldview. You don't need me to tell you that. But a rather remarkable thing happened between Virgil and Dante, and it's called Christianity. And its impact was simply enormous in the Western Hemisphere. Obviously, the whole view of man changes, the whole view of life changes, and the purpose of life, and even whether this life is going to be a joyous place or just some vale of tears that you do your best to get through and go for eternity afterwards. Just a completely different view. Let's start with questions. That might be the easiest way to begin. Questions about Dante's Inferno? Yeah.
Well, I noticed that Dante seats himself among the poets to take himself through this journey, and it seems he thinks a lot of himself already.
He sure does.
Doesn't he?
Hey, if you invent...
Was he a pompous, very... Did he find himself to be a very important person at that time then?
Yes, he did. I mean, he was a politician, you know, in addition to being a poet, he was a politician. As you probably know, he belonged to the White Guelph Party, which was a kind of middle class party, as opposed to the Black Guelphs, which were a little bit more aristocratic.
I wondered if he thought he was an equal with...
Oh, he clearly puts himself, doesn't he? I mean, it's a marvelous touch. What's the tone, though? It's hard for us to realize. Is he doing it with a wry smile on his face when he puts himself in the company of Homer and Horace and Lucan and people like that?
Catch that.
Yeah. He. Look, he invents this afterworld here, you know? So part of the fun of this is seeing who he puts in hell. Obviously, he's putting all sorts of contemporaries in hell, and it really is part of the fun of this. You can imagine how the original audience must have just lapped this up in manuscript as it circulated. No, you wouldn't want to do it today, I suppose.
Did he have a sort of tongue-in-cheek attitude while, you know, in the beginning?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. And in his putting himself among the company of great poets, was he tongue-in-cheek? Perhaps he was, perhaps he wasn't. Interestingly enough, if he wasn't, he was right about himself. Right. You know? Obviously a man of this talent does not suffer, I think, from what we would call false modesty. I mean, he's very much aware of his talent. Milton is another one. You're going to meet Milton later on. Yeah. I mean, Milton really had every sense of himself as divinely inspired. He didn't have a lot of doubts about his abilities.
He knew he was talented.
He knew he was great, and he was right. Yeah. Dante, like Milton, is a scholarly poet. Which almost sounds like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? But by that I mean he was extremely well read. Dante was a highly educated poet. He used to brag that he had the entire Aeneid by heart. Of course, this was an age where people had memories, unlike us, where there's no need to have a memory because we have computers and libraries and things like that. One did need to develop one's memory, but he was extremely widely read, as was Milton, as we'll discover. Yeah.
Virgil was the master. He called Virgil the master, and he was the student.
Yeah. Yep. Why Virgil?
I think Virgil, they all had known and they had read it, and it was a teaching poem. But I think that Dante knew that he wouldn't be refuted, because here he's talking about something religious, and who's going to have the courage to come up against somebody that's prophesying hell and things like that? That's kind of intimidating, I would think.
There were plenty of people who thought Dante was full of full of the sixth circle, you know. Yeah, no, I mean, it's hard to separate it. It's easy for us, but at the time it would have been hard to separate out the art and the politics of this. I mean, we're so tied to footnotes here to understand the political reference, but not in his day. Yeah, Valeria?
It's significant in Christianity that the journey starts on Good Friday, ends at Easter.
Sure is. Utterly
and
significant.
also, I kept feeling that Dante was a bridge between Christ and us. Christ went through this journey, went to hell for 3 days, and he ascended into heaven. And it's putting a more humanitarian view of, you know, the man's going through now. It isn't Christ going through this journey. So it puts us in touch with ourselves a little more.
Yeah, so as we said earlier when we were talking about Virgil's trip into the underworld, it is the essential human journey that is being acted out in this epic, is this need to confront all of these sins which are in all of us, or at least are in all of us, as the scholastic philosophers would say, in potentia. Even though we may not act on them, we certainly can recognize them. I want to come back to Virgil as guide. Peter, why Virgil?
Well, it seems that, obviously in our readings it's always been building. You know, Virgil built on Homer, and now Dante is building on Virgil. And I'm looking at this and I say, geez, about 1,000-year cycles here, and I'm wondering what's going to happen at about 2200.
We'll finally get the American epic. Yeah, well, you're right. In one sense, Virgil, because Dante is writing an epic. He's putting himself in epic company here, yeah.
Virgil first introduced the concept of the underworld.
That's correct. Good for you. That's absolutely right. He's building on Virgilian material, yes. There's another reason that goes back to the thematic concerns that we were talking about in Aeneid. The passion reason. What is it that Virgil celebrated in his great epic? Reason. Yeah, reason. Order, exactly. So what does Virgil come to represent? Is human reason, right, exactly. He becomes the perfect embodiment of that quality because it's what he celebrated in his great epic. Let's also remember, too, that this epic was a celebration of Rome, all right? And from Rome comes that Christianity, okay, becomes the seat of power of the popes. So there are all sorts of reasons. We can go on and on. You do it. Don't have me do it. But you can go on and on with why Virgil is the perfect guide.
I was thinking from something you said, could we assume that since Dante was a friend of Augustus and he was a political person?
Virgil was a friend of Augustus.
Virgil. Okay, I'm all mixed up.
Yeah.
Because I was trying to say if perhaps some of these people that were there, it was done for political purposes as a way of being getting on the right side of the person in power.
Kind of too late for Dante, unfortunately, because as Dante writes this and as it's published, he's lived in exile for the last 20 years of his life. Very painful time for him. Separated from his Florence, where he was once a politician in power. Now he's separated from his wife Gemma, separated from his 2 children. Do I dare tell you other things about his personal life? He 20 years separated from his wife and children, and a man of great talent and ego. And you might imagine that he was not utterly lonely. How's that for a circumlocution for his last 20 years, which may account for the enormously seemingly sympathetic portrait of Paolo and Francesca in Canto 5, something that Dante would know.
The Roman gods,
personally.
The Greek gods are no longer here, but he has a great intercessor in Beatrice.
Yes, he does. Beatrice is a remarkable woman. Beatrice Portinari La Vita Nuova is a sonnet sequence that he writes about Beatrice Portinari. I recommend it to you highly. This is a great age of sonnet sequences. It comes out of the French troubadours, song writers, and the sonetto is an Italian form, the sonnet. It means little song, sonetto. And Dante writes some of the most beautiful to Beatrice, whom he meets at the age of 9. It's a marvelous story. He meets her at the age of 9 and just is smitten beyond belief. And then it goes another 9 years before he sees her again. He sees her at 18. And now the love has become not just some kind of little puppy thing, but becomes almost transcendent. And then they go off and marry other people. You know, it just sets the context for the sonnet sequence. And it's a marvelous piece. Beatrice comes to represent love, as Dante understood it, a pure kind of love. The women in this tradition are kind of interesting. I think you'll all find this very interesting as you read through Inferno and look at the women. The medieval view of women is, especially the medieval Italian view of women, is very complex. Anybody know anything about this or want to share with us? One place to put the woman is where? You got it. You got it. Yep, the Virgin Mary. Exactly. You can say it. Yeah, it's the Madonna whore syndrome. Is exactly right. Yeah, you take a woman and you make her unreachable. You make her almost an embodiment of abstractions. You know, beauty, truth, goodness, love, all of those sorts of things, and you kind of worship at her feet. You really are abject before the power of the woman. That's the kind of woman you want to marry. Then there's the other woman, you know, in that medieval view. And it's really quite dichotomous. It's really quite interesting. Dante, of course, celebrates Beatrice as an ennobling love. And indeed, Beatrice comes to represent heavenly love, as you know from your reading, and a kind of grace. Virgil alone is not enough, although Virgil is necessary. Human reason can take Dante the Pilgrim only so far, and then grace is needed. But you might ask, why does Beatrice need Virgil at all? Because it is Beatrice, isn't it, who sends Virgil to rescue Dante. Why doesn't she just come herself? Give you something to think about for a week. Yeah, you might wonder about that. Now, why didn't she just come?
Things, do they?
Oh yeah.
It seemed to be a man's job.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Oh, Barone, boy. Woo! I can just see the meters in the control room doing this. How about questions? So you guys can give it shape. Yeah.
I wanted to. I have obviously not a good translation, and at the same time...
Yes, we should tell everyone you have the Thomas Carlyle Victorian translation.
No, this isn't Thomas, this is John somebody else.
Oh, is it? Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter because there are more footnotes than there are actual translations in here. Yeah, but the thing that I found was almost poignant was when he meets his old tutor.
Yes.
And there was such a warmth there.
Oh, yes.
And the tutor saying, but you must go on. I would love to have you with me, but don't stay for your own good.
Yes, we're going to talk about that the next hour. Good for you. That's a really great scene, isn't it?
I thought so.
Yes.
Very poignant.
Yes. Coming right after the Farinata scene, where the haughty Farinata wondering, what family are you from? His first question, the aristocrat. Yeah, it's very interesting. What you want to watch as you read the Inferno, and you want to watch it very, very carefully, is Dante the Pilgrim's emotional response to the sinners. It is very important that he learn, just as Aeneas must go through a learning process, so Dante the Pilgrim must go through a learning process. And one of the things you want to watch is his emotional response to what he sees. You don't need me to point out that in the upper hell, the sins of incontinence, he swoons several times, doesn't he? He faints away. And what is a fainting if not an extreme emotional reaction to what he is seeing? Let's use Paolo and Francesca as maybe the best example. He hears Francesca's story, and he's so moved by it that he swoons, he faints away at it. And we've got a very, very serious problem here, don't we? That is, we have us emotionally reacting to God's punishment of sin. And the reaction seems to be one of sympathy. What's going on here? We're not supposed to do that, are we?
Well, it says that it's all right to have pity, but to realize that the punishment is evidence of God's justice.
That's right.
And you mustn't have pity for that.
That's right. You must harden your heart against that sort of thing. Yeah.
And he does too, because the farther down he goes,
Precisely.
the less sympathetic he gets, until finally he's really abusive to one of them.
He's abusive to several of them. That's correct.
Very
Yes. Yes. And yes, you're right. It is in the upper reaches of hell that he is most moved emotionally. And as we move down through the circles, he does learn to harden his heart, and very well put, to the point where he even adds to the punishment of sinners.
Perhaps because he committed those sins in the upper hell and didn't.
Hey, they're attractive sins, aren't they? We get squeamish about saying that, but they are attractive sins. They're feel-good sins, and there's a mutuality to them. You understand?
And they're available.
Yeah, there's a mutuality to them. That is, you're not doing violence to somebody. You know?
And fraud is hard for everybody to go out and commit. I mean, you can't go out and, rob a kingdom or kill, but you can always get mixed up in these other things.
You sure can, yeah. It's not very hard at all, is it? Yeah.
When he first meets Paolo and Francesca, they're together in the whirlwind. At first you think, well, at least they're united in love down there, but it's a reminder of their sin.
Yes.
So it's a sort
And there's
of
something
a
even more than that. Is that a consolation that they're together for eternity?
No, it reminds them of their sin.
Yeah. What else does it do? Think about this a minute. What was their sin?
They fell in love.
They were adulterous, right? I mean, Francesca was married to Paolo's brother, an old guy. You got to know this guy was an old guy, and he was physically deformed. You need to know this, all right? Because it makes Francesca's tale the more understandable. They made love, or they made lust, or whatever. I don't, but they made love. All right. What are they now? Are they bodies now? Spirits. Let's talk about some frustration here, guys. They're two spirits condemned forever to be together, and they. Forgive this expression, but they can never do it again. They are just spirits. Imagine the frustration for these two. Oh, my goodness.
But when she realizes that the man she thought she was marrying was a stand-in for the ugly, lame, the older one, I mean, I can see him being punished for it. I can see her thinking she's fulfilling her love until she realized she's been tricked. I mean, I think the actual husband deserved what he got because she never would have accepted him otherwise.
Whoa. Okay, all right. I went to the University of Reading in England to talk to Zig Baranski, who is on the board of the International Dante Society. He's an extraordinary Dante scholar, and let's take a look at the monitor and see what he has to say. Obviously, Beatrice plays an absolutely central role in the epic. Talk to me briefly about Beatrice Portinari and her relationship to Dante.
Beatrice is essentially based upon a literary construct, upon an idealization of woman, which had been developed within, primarily, although it's based on older archetypes, within the Romance vernacular tradition. It's the beloved of the Provençal poets and of the Italian lyric poets, of whom Dante, especially as a young man, clearly belonged to this group of writers.
Yeah, and it's part of that sonnet tradition of the troubadour.
Yes,
yeah.
And the Vita Nuova is the great celebration of woman, of Beatrice in particular, in these terms. What makes Dante's treatment of Beatrice new is that his woman becomes involved with the religious. Although clearly there had been efforts and directions of doing this before that. There's a whole tradition of equating the woman with the angel. And in a sense, what lies behind the idealization of woman is the Christian idealization of woman, which is the Virgin Mary. But Dante makes the coming together explicit, so that what he does through the figure of Beatrice essentially is bring secular love and religious ideas of love together. And at the moment, as soon as you start bringing religious ideas of love into the equation, you're dealing with the whole question, which sort of revolves around that cliche of the Word of God, of what it is that God wants from us, of the message that comes down from God to us. And Beatrice has traditionally been seen, especially in the Commedia, as is interpreted very loosely as the Word of God. She's a kind of divinely illuminated, divinely inspired knowledge. She also represents that part of the divinity that continues to be present in the world, that helps us in a whole variety of ways to achieve salvation. Dorothy Sayers called Beatrice, in a very inelegant but incredibly apposite sort of way, she called her Dante's God-bearing image, and that's exactly what she is.
Perhaps the most affecting episode in the Inferno, and the one that I think most of our students will be moved by, is the Paolo and Francesca episode. Talk to me about modern students' reaction to Paolo and Francesca.
When we go to Francesca, who is clearly the antithesis of Beatrice in many ways, and we need to read them. Both of them are involved with love. Francesca sins because of love. Beatrice saves because of love. Francesca is, in many ways, a much more complex psychologically, from a psychological point of view, and also from a historical point of view, character than is Beatrice, because of the way she's located. Now, Francesca and Paolo, who's really her sidekick, he's her minion, he never even speaks. We mustn't forget, to actually call that second part of Canto 5, the Canto of Paolo and Francesca, is actually wrong. Yes, all he does is whimper away, and and it's only the second half of the canto which deals with them. A lot of people think the whole of Canto 5 deals with that, which isn't true. And also it's misleading, leads to sort of misguided interpretations. Traditionally, as everybody knows, Paolo and Francesca are two of the figures which have sort of conditioned more tears in Western culture than most, and have inspired generations of artists, from musicians, painters, other writers, etc., to deal with their stories, and also to express their irritation that Dante should have put these rather nice, charming people in hell. Poor old Francesca married to this older guy who mistreats her, etc., sort of nice, charming old Paolo. Well, what the hell were they expected to do except to get into bed together? Now, that's exactly the reaction Dante wanted us to have. He himself projects that reaction into the text. What does the pilgrim do but swoon? He faints. He's been overwhelmed emotionally by the encounter by these two people. But that's the point of departure, not the point of arrival as regards that episode. We need to ask ourselves is, how the hell can we feel sympathy for people who are damned? What are we doing associating ourselves with sin? To associate ourselves with sin in this way means to sin ourselves. It's to challenge God's judgment. To say, hey God, you got it completely wrong.
Well, from one point of view, this is what Dante has to learn, isn't it?
Exactly, exactly. The workings of God's justice and the workings of divine justice are a major problem right up to paradise. But what he's doing in that episode is he's precisely trying to underline a certain number of key ideological points. One is the fact that we can't ever quite understand God's justice, the complexity of God's justice. Two is that however your sin may not appear serious to us, if it's a sin and it remains unrepented, then you're going to end up in hell. Purgatory is full of people who committed much more heinous crimes than those of Paolo and Francesca. But they're saved and they're going to end up in paradise because they repented. Paolo and Francesca decided that their challenge to God would persist until their death. They never acknowledged that they did wrong. And if we look at what Francesca says, why is it that we feel so sorry for her? Because she cons us. She's a master rhetorician, is Beatrice. She lays Francesca, she lays the blame on everybody, but herself, on love, on the book they were reading, upon her personal circumstances. they may be for the modern mind in the in the sort of mid-1990s, extenuating circumstances. And they would have been at the time. But from the point of view of divine justice, they're not at all. If you made your marriage vows, then you had to stay loyal to them. And what Francesca does is she doesn't deal up front with what they did. She elides it. The actual sinful action is reduced to a sin, to a kiss. And blame is laid everywhere but upon herself in particular. And yet, because of the psychological realism of the character, if we stop and think about it, given the wimpishness, given the pathetic quality of Paolo, what Dante is implying is if there's anybody who took the lead in all of this, it was Francesca. She's the dominant character, just as she dominates the second half of the canto and the whole of the episode, just as that she's such a memorable figure. And so we've got major discussion about the nature of sin, about personal attitude to sin, about responsibility.
He's alive, isn't he? It was very entertaining talking to him. He was brought up trilingual, Polish, Italian, and English. His greatest ambition was to be a soccer player, and I think it still is. Terrific guy. I'm happy to say, he made points there that you guys made before we went into the tape about Paolo and Francesca. He does make the very interesting case of will, human will. And you'll notice that Francesca tries to put responsibility, as he says, everywhere but where it belongs. And indeed, from one point of view, the Commedia is a kind of anatomy of evil as it relates to the human will. And it can be read quite profitably on that level. Do I dare ask you, Chad, if I turned to you and I said, Chad, you're reading, that's a crazy story. You're reading this old Italian epic. And Fred, I've heard about that. What's it about? How do you answer me? What a horrible thing to do to you, but what would you say to somebody who says, you're reading Inferno, I've heard of that, what's it about?
That's a good question. I think my first impulse would probably be, it's about this guy named Dante who got stiffed by his contemporaries.
Yeah.
And he decided to get them back by writing a little story about it.
Oh, okay, yeah. All right, so you see it as a kind of personal vendetta.
I see it more as just, I guess in a sense. Yeah. It's a big element of it.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna pick on some of you and ask, what's it about?
I think a lot of it has to do with the sins of the church against the papacy and all. He mentions them so much in their granting of benedictions for money and their licentiousness, and pointing out that the hierarchy of the church needed
certainly one of his targets. Yeah, certainly one of its targets. Of course, at the time, you're both essentially saying the same kind of thing, because at the time, it's very difficult to separate out politics from the church. But you're right. And you will see this as a recurring theme now in Western Lit. The attack on the clergy. We have a real love-hate relationship with clergy in our culture. Peter?
Well, there's been a big void in terms of explaining the unexplainable. You know, it started off with Virgil explaining hell, but that was at a different level. I mean, it was explaining death rather than hell.
Yes.
Now the Christians have introduced the concept of hell, and no one has really explained it. And this is a story that had to be told, and he had to define it in terms of that not all sins are equal.
Right. That's right.
So, I mean, this is Dante's explanation for it. Not all sins are equal, so we have to have different kinds of hells for different kinds of sins.
Yes, good point. I mean, as you make the trip down, remember that hell is shaped like a giant cone. Lots of legends why, but the one I like the most is when God threw Satan out of heaven. Down he went through the 9 concentric Ptolemaic spheres, hit the earth, and went all the way to the center of the earth. In short, you know your Ptolemaic universe with the earth at the center and the 9 concentric spheres, with God up in the primum mobile, up in the Empyrean. Satan at the center of the earth would be at the farthest distance from God. God is light, so what are you going to find down where Satan is? Right. God is warmth. What are you going to find down? You're going to find ice, all right? Yes, so it's the polar opposite. As God is a trinity, so when you come down to Satan, you're going to find 3 heads and 3. Yeah, okay, good. You're all connected to the number things. Yeah. So I was making a point, and I'll be damned if I can remember what it was. Yes. So as you move down the circles of hell, you're moving from the least offensive sins to the most offensive sins. Yeah. They get more serious as you move down. This is explained to you in Canto 11. It's based on Aristotelian philosophy, and it's also based on scholastic philosophy, that is medieval scholastic philosophy about the powers of the soul. In essence, I can shorthand give you a kind of clue. You share with you share the nature of your soul with what is below you in the chain of being and what is above you in the chain of being. There is a metaphor that springs up in the medieval period called they didn't call it. It has become to be known as the Great Chain of Being. And the Great Chain of Being postulates orders of creation, orders of animate nature. We start with God at the very top. God who lives in the Imperium, in the Prima Mobile. Below God are angels. What are they? They're bodiless, but they can put on body. You hear them described as pure reason. They share that intelligence, that intellect and soul with the divinity. Below the angels comes people, come humans. We share our soul and reason with the angels. Below humans are animals, okay? And we share all sorts of things with animals. Biological drives we share with animals. The need to eat, the need to gather, the need to reproduce, okay? That sort of thing. And then below the animal is the plant, okay? And I'll just stop there, and then we could go below that into minerals, and it really gets all sketched out, and it's based on old Greek philosophy. And it becomes an important animating idea in the medieval period, and we will return to the Great Chain of Being again and again this term. Just to point ahead, we're going to read Hamlet, and you know the great speech in Hamlet, what a piece of work is man, and he talks about it in terms of this great chain of being. You should be aspiring upward. You should be aspiring to be angelic. All natural movement ought to be up to God, moving up toward God. But what happens, alas and alack, is we feel the pull of what is below us on the chain of being. Human beings are in that curious middle state where we are part animal and part angel, and we're just tugging back and forth. As we aspire to be one thing, we become another. As we move down the circles of hell, we are moving to increasingly serious sins. In other words, we're moving up the chain of being. So it is the intellectual sins, the sins of our soul that we share with the angels, that are punished most severely in the pit of hell. It is the generative sins, the sins of incontinence, the things that we share with the plant and animal world, that are up at the top. So that handout on the schematic Thomistic soul sketches that out rather neatly for you.
When you ask what is the Divine Comedy to us, a simple answer is us. It's us.
Well, that's an interesting question. Can I ask it in a different way? Do I have to be a medieval Catholic to read this thing?
No. Just being a human being.
But I don't buy this stuff. I mean, I read this stuff and go, hell, get out of here. There's no hell. That's some silly old idea. Where is it? You'll point down, right? What are we, a Ptolemaic universe or something? The only way you could point is up, and then you look at the universe and wait a minute, what's up and down? You know, it starts to get very confusing, you know. And we all know where heaven is, right? It's up there somewhere, you know. We know that hell is in. This is nuts, you know. This is silly.
Wasn't it interesting that in the clip he mentioned that Francisca did not repent, and that's why she was there. Now, if she had, she would have been forgiven.
That's correct. That is absolutely correct.
It shows that Dante must have known the Bible at the time. because he knew it very well.
Clearly, I want to know, though, do I have to be a medieval Catholic to read this thing?
You don't have to be a medieval Catholic, but maybe you have to be a poet. The part of poet that struggles with the question of humanity. Dante's struggling with his own question of reason, passion, of knowledge, of justice of God, his pilgrimage, his journey.
So it's in every person's journey.
I think so.
Yeah. And
so that's where we come in as part of it.
Yeah. Do I have to posit hell as a place?
No.
Why not?
Hell can be in the mind.
Yes, state of mind.
It has to be a place to shun, and heaven's a place to gain.
But it could be a state of mind to shun.
This could be all state of mind.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to be literal place.
It's our pursuit of perfection in God's eyes that we all struggle with, I think. The human journey, as you said before, the essential human journey, I think this is what this talks about.
Yeah, so one has to confront what?
Ourselves.
The self in that journey through the inferno?
Just ourselves. And for me, it's just ourselves.
Yeah.
Well,
It sounds like Virgil, sounds like Milton is what it sounds like, because Milton will say that the mind is its own place, can make a hell of heaven, a heaven of hell. It's one hell of a line, if you'll excuse me, but suggesting that it does become a state of mind. And of course, in modern parlance, who is the guide here? The guide becomes the analyst, right? Who takes you into your past, right? No, I'm serious. That's how they see themselves. Yeah, yeah. In modern terms, yeah, I meant that quite severely. Yes, exactly. Takes you through that trip into your inferno, and has you confront all of those things. And as a guide, only as a guide, right? You make the journey. And the analyst guides you through that dark night of the soul.
Actually, it's in terms of picture or metaphor, it's a medieval way of looking at the history of consciousness. With Beatrice, one understands that the Latin phrase, the tears of things, something is there beyond that love can give you a bigger picture and take you out of the depths to which you can sink and from which you can climb up.
Yes, it is Beatrice. Yeah, good for you. It's also human reason that can lead you. What's interesting about Dante is it is not just Beatrice. You know, it is Virgil and Beatrice that get him there. Yes, but I asked you, why didn't Beatrice just come to him herself? And the suggestion seems to be that grace alone will not rescue you when you're lost in a dark wood. Dante is the pilgrim is lost in a dark wood as this thing opens, and we all understand what that allegorical dark wood is, and he needs to use his reason. Grace cannot move the individual unless the individual moves the self. You with me? It takes it. Yeah, you got to do your part. And that's Virgil's role of human reason leading him as far as it can, but only so far. It can only go so far. And it's when he has been, in a sense, made that confrontation and been kind of purified by the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, as he makes his way up into purgatory. It is only then that Virgil can let him go.
Is this the perpetuation of the idea that then what person is saved by his works?
Yes, indeed. Good point. Yes. Works are essential in the medieval Catholic view. Yes, it is not enough. Deeds are essential. Good point. And I wouldn't have made it without your making it. It is not enough to be saved by grace. You have to perform in the world. You have to do things. You have to act in the world. Thanks for that point. That's an important point, and I wouldn't have thought to make it. So we can read this then on one level as a kind of modern discovery of the redeeming qualities of love, how one should live. Well, that sounds good. Yeah.
I don't even know if it's necessarily modern. I mean, it certainly echoes things that are in, if you're a Christian, these are values that you find in the Bible. Right. If you're a Muslim, these are values that you'd find. I mean, if you're a Jew, these are all values that are central to organized religion, or in probably the more modern world, values that we're taught to believe, whether it's through a religious context or not.
Yeah, it does transcend sect, doesn't it? Yeah, clearly. Let's talk a bit. We're going to return to this next class, because we've made some rather large assertions here about this work, and I want to test that out a little bit. Let's talk about the reading of this thing. How does it read for you? Was it easy?
If I read it out loud.
Oh, yeah. Why?
It just made more sense to me.
You didn't get bogged down in the footnotes? At what point did you start gnashing your teeth going, oh, do I have to read those footnotes?
Yes, all the time. I didn't like that.
Yeah, it's no fun, is it? One of the reasons, of course, is because we're dealing in the realm of allegory. And it's important, I think, for us to talk briefly about that, because that's a whole new form for us this term. We've moved from classical epic into a medieval epic, a Christian epic. And boy, do we notice the hero different? Dante, the Pilgrim, is the epic hero. And this is a guy who's, does he have the stature of Achilles or Aeneas? He's a bumbler, he makes mistakes and he gets confused and he needs help. And isn't that the view of man? Isn't that the Christian view of man?
Pilgrim's Progress.
Flawed, finite. It's our old Oedipus view of the human being as being crippled and blind, Yeah, we're prone to error. Yeah, this hero is kind of wandering here and needs help, needs a lot of guidance. You could imagine Achilles in this trip, right? Just hacking his way through through the Inferno. This is very different. And we're dealing with allegory. Allegory is tough to read, isn't it? Allegory, how should we think of allegory? Allegory is a way of saying a lot in little, which is, I suppose, what all figures of speech ultimately do. It seems to me why we use figures of speech is to say a whole lot in little. Who of you knows my fiancée? None of you, right? So I want to say to you, she's unfamiliar to you, so I want to tell you something about her, so I will use the simplest of figures of speech. I'll use a simile. You all remember a simile, right? And I will say, my love is like a red, red rose. Right? And I've used a simile. I have taken the unfamiliar, my love, and I've communicated an awful lot about her by simply comparing her to something familiar to you, a red, red rose. What have I said about her? Watch what we can do with this.
Well, she's very, very lovely, but she does have her sharp edges, too.
Ah, good for you, yes, good for you. It's a cultivated flower with thorns, and she is not so easily plucked. Yes, yeah, very good. Eric, what else have I said about her?
Colorful.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I said red, red rose, not white rose or yellow rose. What?
She has a lot of petals that open up. She's got many layers.
Yeah, she's got many layers. Good for you. Exactly how the rose operates, sure. And I said red, red rose, not white, white rose. What have I said about her?
She's intense.
Hubba, hubba. She sure is. It's red, right? And red is intense, and red is passion. We could play this game, we'd go right through the room, and we wouldn't exhaust the simplest, cliched, right? Simile. Now, what does allegory do? Think of the allegory as the simile or metaphor backwards from the other angle. What the allegory gives you is the rose, and you've got to figure out it's the lover. You with me? So when Dante is lost in a dark wood, it's working on the narrative level, to be sure. All allegory has to do this. It has to make sense on the narrative level, but it also has an allegorical level. It also means something else. And that's part of the fun of reading Dante's Inferno. He's in a dark wood. That has held so strongly that we to this day talk about it, don't we? Of being lost in a dark wood. And it's almost the, what would we call it today? He's midway through life's journey. Come on, you know where I'm going with this, right? It's classic midlife crisis. It's like if you don't have one now, something is seriously wrong with you, you know? Right?
I'm great for puns. The sins are the things you would do even though you knew you shouldn't.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yes. The sins are very attractive.
Right.
Yeah, especially the sins in the upper hell are very attractive. They get considerably less attractive, I think, as you move down. And it's easier for Dante to harden his heart. But back to this allegory a moment. What we have to do then as we read is to see both the characters and the events as both literal in the narrative and as standing for something else. One of the great allegories, the Middle Ages, by the way, is famous for the allegory. There are just tons of allegories written. One of the most famous being the Romance of the Rose. So that's one of the reasons I use the rose imagery. It's about the poet's lover, but you only hear about the rose. You've got to figure it out. You figure out it's the
And the symbolic retribution of the sin goes through the whole
spectacular.
Inferno.
Spectacular.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The opportunists that you meet in the vestibule, right? What's their punishment? First of all, what was their sin? They never stood for anything, did they? They never took a side, you know? They were relativists. I had a student once tell me that if the Inferno were rewritten today, everybody would be in the vestibule. Everybody would be in the vestibule. Boy, you wouldn't be able to be packed in like sardines blowing around. Yeah. And of course, they didn't make choices, you know, they didn't come down, oh, maybe, mamby-pambies. And so they're blown around by the winds, chasing a banner they can't even read, you know?
Because that's the way their life was.
Exactly. The law of symbolic retribution is really quite fun to watch, you know. You go to the gluttons. Remember Chaco the hog, you know? Chaco the hog. Disgusting. I mean, that's really the first realm where the stench is overwhelming. And you really do, as you read, you must try to use all your senses because Dante wants you to do that. And oh yes, the slime and the vomit and the offal and you know, oh gosh, just disgusting. And if you love to eat like I do, I love good food. I mean, I will go to great lengths to eat good food. And I'm starting to rethink this, you know? I don't want to, I mean, food's important, but it's not that important.
Did Dante make a lot of people uncomfortable with that
Count on it. Oh, of course
I
he
imagine
did, yeah.
they were all wondering.
From one point of view, though, Rosemary, this is a kind of science fiction, a medieval science fiction. When I talked to Zig Baranski, I asked him what he thought the most profitable way was to read Inferno for the first time. And he said, read it as an adventure story. And he quite surprised me. I thought he would talk about to read it on a moral level or to read it on an allegorical level or whatever. And he said, no, he said, read it as a good adventure story. That's what it is. And he's right, isn't he? If you think about it, as you read through, it makes so many appeals to your senses that it really is quite fun to imagine it as you go through.
With Dante's scholarly education, he must have read the scriptures, so there is a lot of simile in that, in the parable.
Absolutely true. Good for you. There are two. This is frequently described as the great masterpiece of the Middle Ages because it sums up the Middle Ages. This is an exciting time in Florence because it is the first inklings, really, of what we came to know as the Renaissance, And what happens in the Renaissance is a celebration of humanism. And by that I mean classical texts are rediscovered. Two traditions come together in the Middle Ages that appear to be incompatible, and somehow the age brings them together almost seamlessly. And the two traditions are, and you could tell from the Inferno, look at the frame of reference in the Inferno. It is, on the one hand, to the classical world. You see all of those references to Greek and Roman writers, to that classical world. And on the other hand, look at the jailers, look at the tormentors, look at the rivers, you know, and go on and on with this. And on the other hand, the great tradition that comes to the Middle Ages and informs it is the biblical, the Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition, both Old Testament and New Testament. The great triumph then of the Middle Ages is what scholars call this syncretism, this bringing together of these two traditions in an almost seamless way. And Dante does that. They're two very different traditions that don't at all seem at war with one another, do they, during this poem? They quite comfortably coexist during the course of the poem. Barbara.
I think what bothers me about Dante is the degree of his sinning. I mean, it's like he is defining for us, you know, what degrees these sins are in, and I just kind of resent that.
Well, let me throw it back at you. Which ones would you not include? You got a few there you want to move around?
It's not that I wouldn't include them, but I just don't like the order in which he is laying them down for us. And for instance, the adultery is in the second. The lower you get, the worse the sin is. So adultery is in the second circle.
Right.
So this was kind of convenient for him. And
I think I said that at the top of class, remember?
And it's not, I mean, it's one of the, I don't remember which one of the 10 Commandments, but it's certainly one of the most important ones. But I just feel that, yeah, he's a great poet, and you know, but this is just too much of a prophet to me, and I just don't think of him as a prophet.
Yeah, this is why I asked the question of whether you had to be a medieval Catholic to read Dante, because from one point of view, you do have to understand why the sins are where they are. You do have to come at it as a medieval Catholic, and you do have to understand the orthodoxy within which he's working. You do have to know that sins against the concupiscible level of the soul are less serious than sins against the intellectual level of the soul, according to that medieval Catholic point of view. But as you do that, you must also, I think, as you rightfully do, view it as a modern and say, no, this just is not the way. This does not reflect my scale of values. And you're perfectly right in suggesting that.
Telling me, I mean, who is he?
Yeah.
You know, he's a writer, he's a poet, but he is not a prophet, and he's not a great religious man, you know. So I appreciate it on a literature. I'm trying to appreciate it on a literature.
Listen, I want to tell you, your reaction is not at all uncommon.
But I think he thought he was rather important, and therefore he could say these things, and hopefully people would.
In terms of the entire Commedia, the lesson couldn't be more important, because in terms of the entire Commedia, Dante is talking about how we finally gain union with the divinity. And nothing is more important in the medieval point of view.
But if you even look at Christ's life, though, okay, first of all, if you talk about the 10 Commandments, if God rank ordered them, number 1 was, don't take my name in vain. And he did put them in some order, supposedly, and this is the order. So that does put number 6, adultery, down there, and says nothing about a number of other things. Then Christ gave us 2, which were more general, but I think more difficult.
And in many ways more difficult, yes.
Yeah, quite
love
more difficult. Yeah, because the spirit of the law enters in here, as well as the letter. But, oh great, now I forgot where I'm going. But,
it's the hot lights.
Yeah, no, shoot.
Well, we'll come back to it. Charlie?
How was the Inferno received in Dante's own time, especially by the church?
Yeah, fabulously, as a matter of fact. It circulated wildly in manuscript for the first several years. And then pro. I mean, it was a
by the church too?
Yeah, well, who's the church, Charlie, in that question? You know, if you mean by Boniface, no. you know what I mean? But for the if the church is the people rather than the institution, you understand the point I'm trying to make. And then Boccaccio started giving lectures on Dante, and so within 50 years of his death, he was enormously famous and widely read. Yeah.
In my mind, for some reason, I'm not getting these time slots correctly, and not that timelines are all that perfect. But I hear us talking Christian, and Christian, as far as Christ walking this earth, did not exist at this particular time.
No, of course not.
So we're not talking Christianity as such, but we are seeing a blend of what in religious circles they talk about pagan people and the church, and it's probably why it was so popular, because it appealed to everybody. And it was a blending of religion
That's
and
that syncretism. That's that syncretism I was
So that's
talking
what we see, and that's why it's not what we're accustomed to either. Because in Christian thought, things are a lot clearer as far as humans would take that. Because I see, some confusion even about.
Let me tell you where we have a problem in any modern audience when we talk about Dante's Inferno, is the multi-religious perspective that's even in this room.
Right.
You start talking about Christian as if your Christian's my Christian.
That's true.
It may or may not be. For Dante's audience, we did not have that kind of multiple perspective. It was a medieval Catholic audience. They would understand just exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it.
I think that with everything we've looked at so far, we've had to accept a framework.
Yes.
And it exists inside that framework.
That's correct.
It is totally intelligible at that time and that place for those people,
Right.
given this framework. We did that when we were talking about Achilles as a character, how he was perfectly natural in this setting, regardless of how many faults you thought he had. So was Aeneas, even in his treatment of Dido, as terrible as everybody thought that was. Within that framework,
Right. It was the
that
right
he had
thing
to
for him
exist,
to
it was
do.
the right thing
Yep.
for him to do.
Yep.
Now you're talking about a much more complex accumulation of ethics and morality that have arrived at a very sophisticated blend. And that too has its framework. So you have to accept those sins in the order that they are given.
That's very nicely
Because
done.
pride goes before a fall was the ultimate Christian sin.
And I'm going to take you a step further. That was very well put. I want to applaud you. That was very well done. I want to add one thing, though. What also gives these works such vitality, and I think we've found that so far, is that not only are they self-contained, they also resonate out. I'm back to my rock in the pond image that I hit you with a couple of weeks ago. Yes, we read it as medieval Catholics, but if we could only read it as medieval Catholics, we would be alienated from it, wouldn't we? We wouldn't be able to read it as moderns. And one of the things that's extraordinary about the stuff we're reading is that it allows that. It allows us to come at it as moderns and reinvent it, for our own intentions. We have very little time, Jim.
Yeah, there's a sociological term for the condition you described. It's called cultural relativism.
Yes.
Where you look at a work using the framework, and it's very hard for other people, or at least, speaking for me, it's hard for me to look at a work solely from that perspective. It's hard to be value neutral.
You have to look at it with hindsight. I mean, you
That's
can't
true.
look back knowing, feeling the way we do today and say, well, he really should have done something a little bit differently here because, 90% of us really don't agree with them. But you see, at that time, given the materials that he had to work with, the culture that he worked with, the ethics, the morality, he couldn't have done anything else.
That's true, but
He would have been a heretic if he did anything else.
my point is simply that it's very hard to do that, although that is what we're supposed to be
But see,
doing.
that's our obligation, is to go back and find out its origins.
And my obligation is to hop in and say, that's it. And we're going to do it again next week.